And the idea is to have several roundtables on contemporary events with experts that can help us reasoning on these relevant events. And of course, it's not by chance that the American elections are the first topic we want to address, given not only the central relevance of the elections in the United States, that explains also the record of participations, but also the attention that this event adds outside of the United States, given the perceived risk that the election of Trump and the Trump administrations as represented well beyond the United States. We have with us to address these issues two great colleagues and two great friends that have been with us offline in the past often, and that we hope to host again soon. Both are from Cornell universities. Ken Roberts, who is a Latin Americanist, but also comparativist that is pursuing a long project of comparing Latin America and Southern Europe, and of course also the United States. He has written a very inspirational book on the role of parties and the changes in the party system in Latin America. The second great friend and colleague that I'm very happy to host once again at the Scuola Normale is Sid Taro, who is one of the founding fathers and mothers of the social movement studies and the founders of the studies of contentious politics. He is formerly emeritus professor at Cornell, but never stopped to be very active. Among others, he has just finished a book on the movement parties and the relationship between movement and parties in the United States, which is going to be published soon. I want just to introduce two main sets of questions, then ask Ken and Sid to address some of them, and then open the floor for the other participants. All people could participate. I see that we are 61 at the moment, so if you want to ask questions, you can do it both by taking the floor, asking for the floor, and by sending a written comment. So the two main sets of questions that I want to address to Ken and to Sid, thanking them once again for having accepted to participate. One is the conditions for Trump's defeat. We have all been very anxious on the 4th of November. Then we are starting to analyze the first results. And I was interested in having your opinion, Sid and Ken, on mainly two issues about the conditions that allowed Biden to succeed where Clinton had not. One is changing social coalitions. So what we have seen, at least from first type of research, is that there are strengths but also weaknesses in the social basis of the electoral vote for Biden. One is in the distributions of voters with those in very low or low income, have a low income, and those who have very high income are overrepresented in Biden electorate. Women are overrepresented but a bit less than it was expected and it happened in the past. Ethnic minorities have voted massively for Biden, but the Latinos seems to have been divided, especially in Florida. And the fact that it is an urban coalition. So what does it tell us in terms of the conditions that brought about the defeat of Trump? Always in terms of conditions, there is a debate about the role of progressive social movements. Black Lives Matter has been considered as an important catalyzer of the vote for Biden. I've read an opinion poll which says 1/5 of the Americans believe that Black Lives Matter was important in determining the electoral results, but they do not agree on the reasons why it was important. But there is also a mobilization of sorts of movements within the Democratic parties with the progressive sides that has mobilized in different forms. So this is a set of questions, and the second set of questions that I think are important to address for all of us is, where do we go from here? Not only where do we go in terms of how do we get Trump out of the White House, but also what are the weaknesses, the strength the Democratic parties, the new administrations, the progressive forces can rely upon. So we know of some institutional challenges, maybe no majority in the Senate, a Supreme Court that is in the hand of the conservatives. But we know also that there are very, very radical needs for change. The pandemic is still out of control. Unemployment is still 11 millions and many more millions of precarious work. Health insurance is particularly problematic, with 26 millions of Americans without access to public health, and other more with very poor public health. In this context, it seems that, however, the push that brought Biden to the victory doesn't come from a common shared program, but it was rather more anti-Trump, and that now there is divisions within the Democratic Party about what to do. So no previously agreed upon plan, harsh divisions inside the party, and a democratic establishment which is already saying we have to try to pacify the countries by opening up. So I end these introductions by citing a few lines from Sid's last book, not published yet. In the conclusions, he writes, while America's institutions for defending democracy have decayed, the quality of its civil society and its link with the party system, which is very central now, may offer a defense against democratic disintegrations. There is this may offer that I would like also to stress. So under which conditions this high quality or improving quality in the civil society and linkages with the party system may indeed offer a defense against democratic disintegration. So thank you a lot again, Ken and Sid. And I think Ken wanted to address the first set of questions and Sid the second. If so, Ken, please take the floor.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll probably both respond to both questions, but we thought that I'd go ahead and start on the first question, and then I'll give Sid a chance to follow up. But I just want to thank Donatella and the SNS for giving us an opportunity to meet with you today and to talk about the U.S. elections and what this really means for American politics and American democracy going forward. It's been a very stressful period, as you can imagine, in the United States, and there's still, to be honest, a lot of uncertainty as to just where this is going, how this is going to play out in the weeks and months ahead. But we can talk a little bit about that as we go. Let me just say a few words in response to the first set of questions that Donatella posed regarding the outcome of the election and the defeat of Donald Trump, and what this means in terms of the different social bases of the Democratic and Republican parties and the kinds of coalitions that were built. And let me start by saying I don't want to be too much of a wet blanket, because we're all feeling relieved to the sort of the collective sigh of relief in the United States. And there's been a lot of celebrating this weekend, as you can imagine, despite the virus. And so we feel good that in essence there was a defeat of Trump that was, I think, very important. But it's important to keep in mind, I think, that this was a battle, and that defeating Trumpism as a political project goes well beyond this particular battle. It's going to be an ongoing process, and so this is not going to go away. And to be very honest, I would argue that the defeat of Donald Trump was not a resounding victory on the part of progressive forces or on the part of the Democratic Party in the United States. In fact, what jumps out to me when I look at the election results, what is the single most impressive observation that I have is simply the extent of continuity or the stability of the vote in the United States. It was a remarkably stable set of electoral outcomes compared to what we had in 2016, sort of building on the trend lines that have been in place for several decades now in the United States. So there's very, very little shift in the vote. The main change was in the turnout. Right. So what really took place in this election was there was a very significant increase in the percentage of the electorate that voted, from about 60% of the population voting in 2016 to over 2/3 of the population that voted this time around. So it's a very significant expansion of the electorate, but that expansion was not on one side as opposed to another. So it was not a groundswell of support for the Democratic Party in running against Donald Trump. So the new voters basically were split into the two camps in roughly the same proportion as what we had seen in the past. So there's actually very little shift in the vote. The percentage of votes that went to third parties went down. So what that meant then is that the vote for both the Democrats and the Republicans increased. So Trump's vote actually increased in this election, as did the vote for Biden as compared to what Hillary had. So the Democratic Party's vote went up about 3 points, and the Republican Party's vote went up about 1.5 points. And there was just enough change on the margins in a handful of key states in the Midwest that it flipped the Electoral College in 4 or 5 different states. And so that was ultimately decisive. We have to keep in mind that Hillary Clinton also won the popular vote. She won by about 3 million votes. Biden won by about 5 million votes. So there was some shift in the Democratic direction, but it was certainly not a groundswell shift or a repudiation, I would argue, of the Trump administration. Trump's vote went up. The number of people, the 71 million Americans voted for Trump in this election, and he achieved almost 48% of the vote. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Where the Democrats picked up votes, largely in the suburban areas. Right? You're probably aware in the United States there's been a very sharp urban-rural cleavage in recent years that is accentuated now with the rise of Trump. And that continued in this election. What was different was that the Democrats picked up vote in the suburban areas that traditionally are white and relatively well-to-do, and they tend to vote Republican. But especially well-educated suburbanites voted more for the Democratic side. So the Democrats picked up votes in suburban areas. Very little change in the other demographics in terms of support for the Democratic Party. Remarkably, Surprisingly to a lot of people, Donald Trump actually increased his vote among not only Latinos in the United States, but also African Americans. And so there was some increase in the non-white vote for Trump. In fact, Trump received, we believe, keep in mind they're still counting the votes, so we don't have absolutely final voting results yet. But Trump apparently received the highest percentage of the non-white vote that any Republican candidate has received in 60 years, since Richard Nixon was defeated by John F. Kennedy in 1960. Right. So despite all of his discourse and his policies against Latinos and everything else, he increased his vote both among African Americans and Latinos in the United States. So when you look around at the distribution of the vote in the coalitions of the different parties, there are not dramatic changes. What was very important in this election, the youth vote. The youth vote is very heavily skewed towards Biden and the Democrats. So that's continuing a trend line. It was a little bit sharper this time around, in particular because the turnout was quite high. A lot of what hurt Hillary in 2016 was the youth vote was low in 2016. They were much more energized in this election. I think that probably has something to do with the social mobilization and the protest movements around Black Lives Matter. Some surveys indicate that as many as a quarter of young people in their teens and 20s who voted, as many as a quarter probably participated in marches and social protests this summer, which is quite high. And so I think that the protest movement probably energized the bases, especially among young people, and I think it was very important in shifting the outcome. But it also probably, it's sort of the other side of it, the counter mobilization side. Donald Trump played very heavily to the law and order kinds of discourse in appealing to the Republican Party bases. And keep in mind, their bases turned out as well. So in a context of acute political and social polarization, the grassroots mobilization on the progressive side, feeding into the Democratic Party through the social movements, may have triggered a counter mobilization on the other side that was, that Donald Trump was able to appeal to. So basically, it's reinforcing both sides in a hyper-polarized context. But otherwise, the vote for Trump remained very heavily male. It remains skewed towards not so much the elderly, but basically everybody who's non-youth. The vote for Trump very heavily male. So there was a significant gender gap that remained. And the vote for Trump much higher in small town and rural Americas in the so-called heartland of the United States, and also much higher among those without a college education. So the Democratic vote much higher among those with a higher education, and much higher among women and racial and ethnic minority groups, even if Trump's vote actually went up among racial and minority groups. But still, about 70% of non-white citizens voted for the Democratic Party candidate. A source of considerable concern, I would argue, for the Democratic Party and for the progressive cause. We think the white blue-collar vote went about 67% to Trump and only 31% for Biden. In other words, more than 2 to 1, the white blue-collar, non-college educated vote went for Trump. That's continuing a trend line that has been underway for quite some time. I would argue that's very worrisome for moving forward for a progressive project in the United States. So let me stop there, and I'm hoping that Sid can maybe give us a more positive spin on the outcome. But that's my take of what what happened in this election. As I said, there is an underlying stability in these social cleavages that we see in American politics. And what really took place, I think, in this election was a mobilization on both sides of that cleavage, but remarkably little shift in the vote crossing those basic cleavages in American politics. So Sid, I'll stop there and I'll let you tell us your interpretation of what just happened.
Well, thanks.
Thank you. And I think Sid has the task of cheering us up a bit, because what Ken said means the challenges are still there and very relevant. So how can the civil society and with its link party system defend them from democratic disintegration?
Thanks, Donatella. And thanks, Ken. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you. Very glad to be back in Palazzo Strozzi, even virtually. Reminded that the first time I was in Palazzo Strozzi was in 1959 when I was a student in Florence, and I feel that it's a wonderful return, even though it's a virtual one. You described yourself at the beginning as throwing a wet blanket on the picture of the American election. I would say you are not so much a wet blanket as maybe a damp blanket. I would support much of what you've said, but add a few codicils and possibly a few different perspectives. The first thing I think we need to remember is that in a historical framework, American politics in presidential elections never shifts very much. Particularly with a two-party system, we have very little change between one party and the other. And so whatever changes we have may look very small, but might be significant. The second point I'd like to make is that among these marginal changes, a few of them stand out. Ken has focused on the continuity in the support for Trump among lower class and lower middle class white voters. I think that's right. Certainly that's right. But there has been one change, and that is a bit surprising, and that is the vote for Biden among men went up by 7% compared to the vote for Hillary. Now, I should parenthetically say I'm basing my comments on some results that were put together by the University of Virginia's Miller Center last week. And so they may differ somewhat from the results that Ken is looking at. Certainly, Ken is correct, and I underscore this, that the biggest change was the result of the increase in turnout, and particularly the turnout among young voters. Part of this may certainly have been a result of the mobilization of the summer protests. Another part may have been the fact that young people are sitting at home with not very much to do and were energized not only by the summer's protest, but by the election campaign. And this helped to turn certain states that are traditionally Republican, like the state of Georgia, from red to, if you will, light blue. And as you all will know, the results in the senatorial races in Georgia have still not been decided, and there will be a runoff in January, which will determine who controls the Senate. But places like Arizona and Georgia, which are traditionally very conservative, turned blue, or at least pale blue, in this election. The other change, I think, and here I also agree with Ken, the other change was, I think we can say, the result of the implantation of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this movement goes back to the early part of the decade, and many people say it's a new civil rights movement. Well, it is a civil rights movement, but it's different in quality. Remember that the civil rights movement was founded in the South by African-American ministers and young male supporters. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded by 3 non-white women in California. And I think we have to remember that the civil rights movement traditionally was very male-led, the Black Lives Matter movement today has a very strong support from among Black and other women. The third shift that I think is worth looking at, even though it's a marginal one, is that among men, 48% voted for Biden compared to 41% who voted for Hillary in 2016. That gap is affected by race and ethnicity, with an 11-point gender gap in favor of Biden among Black men and 9% among Latins. So the surprising result was that there was not a major increase for the Democrats among women. That increase occurred in the 2008 midterm election, but there was a significant increase in American terms among men. The other major difference between the two is education, where 55% of college graduates voted for Biden compared to 49% who voted for Trump. Biden also made gains among white voters without a college degree, who were 7% more likely to support him than those who had supported Clinton a few years earlier. And then the most surprising result, although it is a marginal one, is that Biden chipped away at Trump's support among older voters. Among voters older than 65 years of age, he had an 8-point gain vis-a-vis Clinton's support in 2016. This could be the result of the coronavirus. It could also be the result of the fact that Trump showed a great deal of lack of interest in supporting older people's health care. But whatever the reason, while Trump still maintains a lead among older voters, that lead was cut into by Biden. So in summary, while Biden built on the Democratic core of minority, well-educated, and female voters who had also supported Clinton, he made small but significant gains among younger voters, among whites without a college degree, among older voters, and among one other group which had been very strongly supportive of Trump, and that's Catholics. We can understand that in part because Biden is a practicing Catholic, but it is striking that Catholics appear to have moved somewhat back towards their traditional home in the Democratic Party over the past 4 years. However, I don't want to be too much of a Pollyanna, and I want to point out, and in this I agree with what Ken was saying, that while Trump may be gone, and I think he is gone ultimately, I don't think the Trumpist movement will disappear. There are some reasons for that I'll get to in the second set of remarks I make, but I think it's very important that while Trump may disappear and may even go to jail, the Trumpist movement is going to still be with us. That's about all for now, Donatella. I look forward to Ken's comments on the next set of questions.
Yes.
Okay, so I think, Donna, on the second set of questions, I think, Sid, we were going to have you go first. Is that right? Did you want to?
I think that's right, if that's okay with Donatella.
Yeah, that's okay with me. So I don't know whether you want to repeat the question, but I'll let you go first.
Okay. So the question really was, what are the challenges for progressives and for the social bases of politics in the future, where there's a divided Democratic Party and where there's a complex set of alliances between different social groups that are necessary to continue or to increase this base. Let me begin by saying something that comes from my recent conversion to the study of American politics. and that is the difference between the Democratic and the Republican parties. For a variety of reasons, the Democratic Party is different than the Republican Party in that it is fundamentally structured as a coalition of interest groups, while the Republicans are fundamentally an ideological party. And this comes from an enormous amount of evidence gathered by two American political scientists, Grossman and Hopkins, who have written a book called Asymmetric Politics, the differences between the two parties. The Democrats have always been, or at least since the New Deal and Roosevelt, have always been a coalition of interest groups. And that has certain implications. For one thing, it means that there will always be divisions within the Democratic Party between different policy-seeking groups that are seeking to be in the driver's seat of the Democratic Party. Republicans, for at least 20 years, and probably more in my view, have been converted into an ideological party very much in the mode of the former European mass parties. And Republicans would not agree with this because they see European mass parties as being socialist, but in fact, in the dominance of ideology over group interests, ever since the 1960s, the Republicans have been moving in this direction. So there are two implications of this. First, on the Democratic side, that there should be divisions within the party is quite normal for the Democratic Party. Secondly, on the Republican side, that it has been an ideological party for at least 20 years, and I think almost 50 years, means that Trump invented very little. Trump inherited a party that had been taken over by a long conservative movement starting in the 1970s and 1980s. And what that means is that Trumpism, or rather what became Trumpism, has a long history and a deep foundation in the base of the Republican Party. And this, I think, is the major reason why we can expect to see Trumpism survive and perhaps even prosper after Trump is gone. Now, the main line of American political scientists looking at American politics over the last decade is that politics are polarized. Well, the polarization thesis is correct, but it only talks about the horizontal differences between the two parties. And I think America's problem is not polarization alone, but a weakened party system that rests on a foundation of distinct political subcultures. And in that respect, American politics looks more like the Italian First Republic than it does like the past of American politics. The best study of this comes from a political scientist named Liliana Mason in her book Uncivil Agreement, in which she shows that as the parties have grown politically distant from another, they've taken Americans with them. Americans today, she argues, are socially sorted. They live in neighborhoods with members of their own party, they worship in the same churches, and they would not want their children to marry outside their partisan subcultures. This is very important because it takes polarization down to the grassroots of American society, and it operates on a constraint on the capacity of the parties at the summit to negotiate. Paradoxically, like Italy after World War I, the parties are weak as partisanship has hardened into competing subcultures. You can probably see where I'm going with this. The Italian case in 1922 shows that democracy can fail at exactly the moment when negotiation between the poles of a polarized party system could save it. It also failed because of the vision of party leaders who were more convinced of the ideological rightness of their cause than in the defense of defending struggling democracy. So as we say, if the Italian shoe fits, the Americans may be wearing it. But there are important differences. Unlike Mussolini after World War I, Trump, as I've said, invented very little apart from his violent rhetoric and his disparagement of minorities. He built a movement on the basis of what Danny Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld call the long conservative movement that went back to the 1960s. He built it on the basis of two main components, what political scientist Paul Pearson calls populists and plutocrats, the white underclass and the barons of industry. Trump's secret as a president was to continue to offer charismatic leadership and symbolism to the populist base while making policies that benefited the plutocratic class. Now, the movement that grew up to oppose him, what we call the resistance, consisted of minorities, young people, educated whites, and especially women. What this movement had that held it together was Trump. Trump was what we call a negative focal point. We saw this in the results of the elections last week. While Trump lost support among many sectors of his base, Republicans in Congress and in the state legislative elections actually gained votes in comparison to 2016. So as Ken pointed out, there was very little change in the presidential election. There was actually a relative return to Republican dominance in the state and local elections. And what this says to me is that the resistance held together as an anti-Trump movement, not as a fundamentally progressive movement. And that's the dilemma of the post-2020 period. If Trump disappears from the scene, there may be little remaining to hold the anti-Trump movement together. There is one thing that can hold it together, and that is the theme of democracy. As Trump's authoritarian tendencies were revealed as president, part of the anti-Trump movement began to emphasize the master frame of democracy. The problem is that this competes with another master frame, racial justice. Although racial justice is clearly part of democratization, as a master frame, it's more like class in that it gains the support of some parts of the electorate, but loses the support of other parts. And we saw this in the electoral results after the protests of last summer, when polls were carried out with voters and they were asked about their reaction to the protests after the killing of George Floyd. Many of the voters saw it as a result of the riots and the damage. And of course, they voted for Trump, while other voters saw it as democratic protests and voted for the Democrats. Racial justice as a master frame divides rather than unites Americans. Democracy, in contrast, is a master frame that can unite a diverse series of constituencies, even those with contrasting sectoral goals. Unless the frame of racial justice can be merged with the frame of democracy, it too can divide rather than unify. But there is hope. The to unseat Donald Trump brought many activists from the resistance into the Democratic Party. Where they'll go under a Biden administration is not yet clear. If they all end up in the Democratic Party, then we will see a party that remains a party of elites. If they return to private life after the exhaustion of years of mobilization, we'll see much of the same thing. But if many of them return to movement activity, we will see a basis for tempering the moderation of the Biden administration. Before he died, Martin Luther King talked about racial justice as an evidence of the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. My argument will be that the American arc of history will only turn towards justice if movements and parties can cohere around a project of democratic resilience. Okay, Ken, over to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I give the floor to Ken, and just wanted to say, for those who want to intervene, Guglielmo Meardi is taking on the coordination. He has a more stable connection, so just address the questions to him. So please, Ken.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think Sid has identified a number of issues that I'd like to pick up on and run with a little bit, because I think there's a lot of important points that he brought up. First, let me start with the question that he raised about the differences between the two parties in the United States, and how the Republican Party is fundamentally an ideological party and the Democratic Party is not. It's really a coalition of different interests. And I think you see that in this election. When you look at how Biden campaigned, recognizing that he largely campaigned from his basement, so it was not a conventional campaign where he was really out and about meeting with people, but the Biden campaign overwhelmingly ran on what we call valence issues. Valence issues meaning issues that are issues that don't really divide the public, but they're more symbolic, things that everybody would support. They have to do with competency or images. And so essentially, Biden ran against Trump and tried to really turn the election into a referendum on Trump himself. And essentially, Biden ran on his own character and his own empathy, right? So they really tried to help people understand that Biden is more of a people person. He connects, he empathizes, he's been through hardships in his own life. So there was a real effort to try to turn the election into a referendum on Trump and his character and his lack of empathy, especially in the context of the pandemic. And then the other thing that Biden really ran on was essentially the incompetency of the Trump administration in managing the pandemic and basically turning it over to the states. I mean, essentially, the federal government did nothing in the United States in response to the pandemic. So Biden tried to turn this campaign not into a contestation between different ideas or ideologies or philosophies or visions of the future, but essentially into a plebiscite on Trump's competency and his character. And I think the challenge this is going to face for the Democratic Party, or for any sort of progressive alternative moving forward, is Biden is not going to, he's not going to be coming into office with a strong progressive mandate, or certainly a strong coalition to work with in the Congress. So it looks as if the Senate will likely still be in the hands of the Republican Party. The Democratic Party actually lost seats in the House of Representatives. And so in some ways, the congressional position could well be even weaker in Congress, not to mention the courts. So ultimately, assuming Trump does leave the White House and Biden is able to enter the White House, and the Democrats hold the executive branch of government, they won't control the legislature, they won't control the courts. The courts are clearly turned in a different direction, for decades to come in the United States. And so it's going to be very difficult for the Biden administration to really legislate or implement a progressive agenda. And in reality, they didn't really run on much of a progressive agenda. And I think there's going to be a challenge now, because I expect a lot of competition and internal I think there'll be a lot of internal dissent within the Democratic Party between sort of the traditional centrist mainstream wing of the party, which is what Biden represents, and then the more progressive grassroots of the party that have been mobilized in recent years through Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other sectors of the party. And so I think there's likely to be a real tug of war over the course of the Biden administration and the kinds of policies that they might try to implement. Whether they can hold things together may depend in part on whether they can maintain a coalition against what Trumpism represents and a coalition on behalf of democracy. But I think there's likely to be a lot of internal tension within the Biden administration, especially if he's not able to legislate, if the Republican Party really tries to paralyze the government, which is essentially what they tried to do under under Obama. I anticipate they'll do the same thing under Biden. Biden comes from a tradition. He was in the Senate when the two parties were able to work together in at least some areas, so there was a tradition of bipartisanship. He still believes in that. But I think it's a very, very different Washington, D.C. today than what it was when Biden was in the Senate in the 1980s and the 1990s. Extremely difficult to work across partisan lines. And the trouble is, if Biden is not able to advance a progressive agenda, I think there's going to be a lot of disenchantment from the more progressive sectors within the party and a lot of the grassroots social networks that have been mobilized through the protest movement, through the electoral campaigns. We're already beginning to see there's been a lot of bickering over the last week between the centrist wing of the Democratic Party and the more progressive wing around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. My hunch is that there's going to be a lot of conflict around that as we go forward. Ultimately, when I look at sort of a progressive agenda in the United States, I think there's a real challenge because I think they really have to operate on two different levels and try to build coalitions, political coalitions at two different levels. One is simply a level of sustaining the democratic regime itself. And I think it's extremely important to understand that I think we are seeing challenges to the democratic regime that we've never seen before in the United States, the likes of which we haven't seen certainly not in generations in the United States. I think the Republican, as Sid was talking a little bit about changes within the parties, but I think the Republican Party has, for all intents and purposes, developed into an insurgent force in the American democratic arena. It does not accept or abide by the rules of the game, and it is increasingly transparent in flaunting the democratic rules of the game and trying to manipulate the institutional levers that it controls to advance its own partisan and its own ideological agenda. And I think that, and certainly Trump represents that part of the Republican Party. That is going to continue. But I think there are elements within the conservative mainstream of American politics and within the centrist space of American politics that I think the progressives are going to have to work with those other sectors to try to restore the foundations of the American democratic regime itself. And I think there are going to be elements of the Republican Party that are not going to be willing to be part of that project. And I think it's going to be a real challenge for the Democrats to try to marginalize politically the more authoritarian tendencies within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party. And I think that's going to require that they reach out beyond their own parties and certainly reach out beyond the progressive bases to try to build a democratic coalition. At the same time, I think that they need to try to maintain the energy and the social bases that have been mobilized for a more progressive agenda. I think they have to try to identify what are the concrete kinds of reforms in education and support for public education, the healthcare agenda, support for workers, minimum wage campaigns, other kinds of areas where they can have a genuine progressive platform, recognizing that that's going to be a different coalition trying to advance that than what they have in trying to sustain the democratic regime itself. So I think it's going to be very challenging for the Biden administration and for the Democratic Party to try to advance a progressive agenda at the same time as they're having to work with centrists and even conservatives within American politics to try to restore the foundations of the democratic regime itself. I think it's very, very dangerous and very fragile for American democracy if democracy itself becomes strictly a partisan project, right? If it's only one political party that is upholding the norms and rules of the democratic regime, I think it's extremely dangerous for American politics going forward. And so I think the Democrats are going to have to identify who are the other sectors outside the Democratic Party that we can work with to restore faith in the electoral machinery, in the rule of law, in the independence of certain branches of government, the professional character of certain branches of government, because all of those things have been severely compromised, I think, by the Trump administration. And this goes way beyond Trump himself, right? This is really part of what the Republican Party has turned into and the ways in which they are manipulating these different levers within the Democratic arena. So I think it's going to be a rocky road for Biden as we go forward. And I anticipate a lot of conflict, certainly between his government and the Republican Party, which presumably will continue to have a majority within the Senate. But I also think he's going to have a lot of internal contestation over the nature of the Democratic project itself within his own political party. So I'll stop there, and I think maybe it's time probably to open it up for other people who may have questions or comments.
Thank you. Now, first I introduce myself. I'm Guglielmo Meardi. I'm Donatella's deputy. I'm just taking over the coordination. And I would like to give the floor to James Galbraith, so we make the most of all our American friends first. But we also have then two questions coming, and one is from Sarah Tonse. I already read it because it's a difficult one, in case anybody can answer it, whether we can expect any effects of Biden on support for authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So that is the question will come next. But first, the floor to James, if he wants to add something.
All right, here we go. Thank you very much. I would like to make a few remarks that are complementary to those that were made by both Ken and Sid, in particular with respect to Ken's point that this was an election that reflected the essential stability of the American electorate. It was not an election that was in any way, in a great way, out of the ordinary, but there were some things that distinguished it from 2016. The first point already made was the disappearance in effect of the third parties. And that was probably decisive in at least two states, Michigan and Wisconsin, where the Green Party vote was sufficient in 2016 to deprive Mrs. Clinton of the electoral college votes of those states. In terms of the turnout, a crucial point which has not been mentioned is that I believe on the order of 60 or 70 million votes in this election were cast by mail. And that has the effect of greatly reducing, if not eliminating, the structural barriers to voting, which depress turnout characteristically in American elections. Once you can vote by mail, you don't have to find a polling place. You don't have to wait in line, often for hours. Europeans who have never cast a ballot in the United States rarely understand that when you go into the voting booth in the US, you have to vote for federal offices, state offices, county offices, school boards, constitutional amendments and bond issues in your local, down to, in Texas, dozens of local judges. It's a long, arduous process. Voting by mail makes it extremely simple and it greatly increases the ability, particularly of new voters, to come into that process. I think we're looking at something which, as it becomes entrenched in American politics, will increase voter participation, although, as Ken said, it doesn't necessarily have a partisan effect one way or another. On the third point was the crucial shift of this one demographic group from Trump in 2016 to Biden in 2018, and that was the white male. And I think the simplest and least complicated explanation for that is that there were a large group of white males in 2016 who did not wish to vote for Mrs. Clinton. Whether they did not wish to put a woman in the White House or they did not like her personally, simply there were objections to her as a candidate, which were already obvious in the primary campaigns in 2016, and greatly advanced the candidacy of Bernie Sanders at that time, which were absent in 2020. The people had simply had no objections to voting for Joe Biden, and no objections to voting for a candidate who had a woman on as a running mate. Simply, we ran a candidate, the Democrats ran a candidate in 2016 who did not appeal to a significant number of white males. And that was the one group that shifted back in 2020. One might say that misogyny defeated Mrs. Clinton, and then misogyny came back and defeated Donald Trump in 2020. Be a slightly cynical way of putting it. The third point about older voters is to remember is that they're not demographically the same cohort. 4 years later on, a group of people is in that elderly category, and a certain number of the previous group has passed on and is no longer, let's say, in the voting population. Okay, I want to make a remark here which pertains to my role, my professional role as an economist, and to work that a young colleague of mine, Jae-hee Choi, and I published a few months ago in Structural Change in Economic Dynamics, that I think helps to explain not only the division in the American population, but also its specific relationship to the electoral votes in the particular states. What we did was to measure the degree of economic inequality in each state using a set of methods that we developed over a long period of time in each year going back to 1969, and to measure the change in each state up to, for the purposes of this paper, 2014, to look at the 2016 election. And what we found was that the states where economic inequality had increased the most, the 14 states where it had increased the most, every single one of them voted for Mrs. Clinton in 2016, and every single one of those also voted for Joe Biden in 2020. The simple explanation is that the Democratic Party is a coalition, in effect, of two major groups. One of them is what call them the urban professional classes, located in the major cities, relatively well-to-do in the upper end of the distribution, although not the top 0.1%, but let's call it the very prosperous group of people by American standards. And the other is at the other tail of the distribution, the low-income communities, African Americans, the Hispanic voters outside of Florida, Native Americans in small numbers, and other low-income communities, very low-income communities. That's where you find Democratic votes in the Black Belt of Mississippi or along the Texas frontier and in other places. In states where those two groups together add up to a majority, you have a Democratic state. And that is New York, that is California, that is Massachusetts, that is New Jersey, that is any number of the states that Mrs. Clinton won and that Joe Biden won. So what is going on as American politics shifts over time is that as economic and demographic changes have been increasing inequality relatively more in certain states, those states have been drifting toward the Democrats. The prominent examples where the states reached a tipping point, actually not this year, but in 2018, were Arizona and Georgia. Arizona, where a Democratic senator was first elected in 2018. Georgia, where my student Stacey Abrams would have been elected governor had the vote count been honestly taken. What Stacey Abrams then did was to organize a movement that registered an existing population, about 800,000 voters in Georgia between 2018 and 2020, pushing her coalition up to the point where it became very narrowly the majority of the voting population in that state. Arizona and Georgia, therefore, we can say, have followed the path Nevada has already taken, that California took maybe 20 years ago, of a demographic and economic shift that will bring them into the Democratic Party. The state that is coming along behind is the one where I'm presently sitting, it's Texas, where Barack Obama won 40% in 2012, Hillary Clinton won 43% in 2016, Joe Biden won 46% in 2020. It's practically like clockwork. In 2024, I'm telling you, 49%, mark it down. And then in 2028, Texas will make a change that will have a long-lasting effect on the structure of American politics. What do we know if we take these considerations into take them on board? What does this tell us about everything else? It tells us about issues. They're not important. Whatever happened, I mean, some things sometimes are important, but we have no evidence that any issue fought out in this campaign mattered. And in fact, neither candidate was much talking about issues. Personalities, the Democratic Party made a great big deal over 4 years about the personality of Donald Trump. Did it make any difference? In fact, he gained ground in all kinds of groups where you expect the Democratic vote to be the most loyal. He lost them in the one group where you expect offhand his own base to be the strongest. The resistance movement, Black Lives Matter, all appear to be, I mean, you can find evidence that they actually made a difference, that either pro or con in this election. I would say that there's probably going to be exceedingly small difference. Trumpism, and I think this point has already been made, Trumpism will disappear with Trump, but the Republican Party, which is the party of the middle class, is the party of those who are not in either tail of the distribution, and in those states which are dominated by suburbs and rural communities and small towns. That's where the Republican Party is going to win electoral votes. Those states, there are states in the upper Midwest who are drifting in that direction as their industrial centers decay. That's going to be determining the balance of the Electoral College in the United States in the future. And somebody will inherit the Republican Party, take it under a new label. It may be a very harsh label of it's what one might call incipient fascism. Trumpism without Trump may be extremely maybe more competent form of authoritarianism than Trump ever was. But it will be a Republican Party that is based in the same way as Trump's vote, as Bush's vote was before him, and can go back to basically into the 1990s, which is when this pattern begins to emerge. So that would be my point. Demography and economics would give you, and did give us in advance, a very good fix on how the Electoral College would turn out. The polls and the issues turned out to be way off. They turned out not to be accurate in the least. And that suggests the polling industry is in big trouble, but it's not. It doesn't mean that you can't understand the structure of American politics if you look at more fundamental forces. Thanks very much. I could make a comment about the Middle East, but I think I've said enough, and I'll let it go on to others who may know more about that.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have a scattering of various questions, quite disparate. So I will invite everybody who wants to, or is able to answer, among the three people we just listened to, the three colleagues we just listened to, but also others if they happen to have a point to add, but just to be quite short, even if the questions are big. I think all questions can also be answered in a quick way. So the first one was the one on the Middle East. Well, we have a James who half volunteered, but if anybody else who has an insight on what may happen in the Middle East. James,
all right, I'll pop up. My basic view of that is that changing personalities at the top of American politics is relatively easy. Changing policies is relatively hard, particularly when there are important forces that are strongly opposed to any such change. And I would suggest that you pay very careful attention in the next few months to the actions. I know that Secretary Pompeo is on his way to the Middle East in the next few days. There may be an effort to lock in our policy on Iran as a point of maximum confrontation so as to prevent the Biden administration from returning to the Obama administration's negotiated posture, and especially to the JCPOA. That is an obvious priority for a number of players, to prevent that from happening for a number of players in the region. and I don't think we should count them out. This game is just getting underway now.
Thank you. There was also a question from Hans-Jörg Trenz, which, however, has disappeared from my screen. I would like Hans-Jörg to ask the question himself, if he can unmute and appear.
Yes, I can do this. Thank you. I am here basically for learning, so this was a very useful exercise to follow this debate. And from a European perspective, I wonder about a kind of discrepancy in the public expectations about the expected outcome of the elections, especially here in Europe. We tend to assume that the US elections must bring quite dramatic change, which was partly also visible in some of the projections before the vote. And then the outcome shows a remarkable stability. This is something I learned today. And so how do we explain this very slow change in the underlying stability in the electoral cleavage? It's somehow perplexing from a European perspective because we experience much more dramatic shifts in votes and in much shorter time. So even if you take the case of the UK, which also has a two-party system, we observe easily electoral shifts between 10 and 20% from one election to the next. So is it only the two-party system in the US that explains the stability, or is this explained by other factors? Is it maybe precisely because there is such a deep divide of the country that social change and mobilization of electorates is basically blocked there?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, and my sense is that in some, this is a place where the underlying sociological cleavages in American society intersect with the party system and the electoral institutions in ways that make it difficult to really bring about more dramatic changes. Let me just say that doesn't mean that we don't ever get change. I would argue that there has been a fundamental realignment of the American party system that has taken place since the 1960s. And it has to do with the nature of the underlying, what you might call the formative rift, or the underlying racial cleavage within American politics as to whether or not American democracy should be racially inclusive or exclusive. And I think in many respects, this remains a basic divide between the two political parties. But until the 1960s, that basic divide cut across the two different parties. It did not divide the two different parties, right? Because the white Southerners were in the Democratic Party, so you had the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party along with Northern liberals, and the Republican Party. You also had that basic cleavage cutting across the political parties. What's taken place, I would argue, and I would draw a little bit here from one of Sid's colleagues, Doug McAdam, and his work on the impact of the civil rights movement, and then the counter movement, the conservative counter movement away against the civil rights movement, and how it realigned the party system so that the South moved into the Republican camp, and you basically then get you get both economic and cultural conservatives in the Republican camp, and you get liberals in the economically and politically in the Democratic Party camp. And so it's basically divided the waters, and the two parties have become more programmatic over time, and it has sorted the electorate into one party or the other along the different demographic lines that we were talking about before. So in other words, the two parties have become anchored in these different social groups as they've sorted the electorate, and as you then align in terms of ideological preferences or programmatic preferences into one party or the other. And then the electoral institutions, I think, reinforce that because it is very difficult to have a third party competing and getting a significant percentage of the vote. And so there are a lot of ways then in which the combination of presidentialism with plurality elections and then the primary system allows insurgent type candidates such as Trump to compete within the mainstream political parties. And so it's a combination then, I think, the ways in which the social cleavages have been realigned around the two political parties and then reinforced by the electoral system that helps to reproduce this basic continuity that we've seen over time. Sid, if you have other thoughts on that, feel free to jump in.
I do, actually. I've been thinking about the Galbraith Theory, which we might call the economistic theory, and how it does perhaps disguise, or rather coagulate, a number of disparate trends. That is, economic inequality does explain a great deal, but it's very difficult for Americans to distinguish economic inequality from the fundamental dividing line of race. Race, since the 1960s, has divided Americans more than anything else, and has divided the parties more than anything else. And race and economic inequality are very closely correlated. And I think the reason why we have such little change over time in American voting patterns is not because there are no structural changes. There are many structural changes, but those structural changes to some extent cancel each other out. And that's why we have major results from what might seem like conjunctural changes, like a change in voter turnout by a few percentage points, or the presence or absence of third parties, or of a candidate like Hillary Clinton, against whom there was an awful lot of misogynistic dislike. When there are so many different structural changes that cancel each other out, conjunctural changes can mean quite a lot. I do want to respond to one point about the Republicans, and I think this is a very important point. I've said that I think the Republican Party is fundamentally structured ideologically, but that doesn't mean it hasn't changed. The ideological basis of the party, as Ken was saying, has changed a great deal over the decades, and Trump was the culmination of those changes. The question for me is, what will happen if there is no longer a Trump? I believe the Trumpist movement is still very active, and the question is, will that movement stay within the Republican Party, or will it hive off into a violent social movement? There are already signs of parts of the Trumpist movement turning violent and organizing for violence. And this depends a great deal on the direction in which the Republican Party goes. If the Republican Party turns away from Trumpism and moves back towards something like what it was before, that is, a moderate center-left party with several factions, then I would believe that the extreme Trumpist nationalist minority may very well move out of the electoral arena and will move into the status of a violent social movement. And that's the real danger of polarization today.
Thank you very much. Now, maybe I list the 4 questions remaining so that then we can start thinking who is going to answer each of them. The first one is what makes it impossible to have, from Maria Bakarjeva, what makes it impossible to have a third party? Maybe it has been already answered by mentioning the disappearance of the Green Party, but if anybody wants to add why there is no third party, and whether it is possible or not to think of a third party. Then Manuela Cayana had asked about the risk of an institutional conflict in the US between President, Senate, and Supreme Court. Then we have Mario Pianta, who asked what may make it possible for white working class male voters to vote in relation to their interests rather than just their feelings. What can change, given it seems to have become such a big block for the Republicans? And finally, there is a question from Dario Di Conzo, which is similar to the one the one we started with, that is whether we can expect any change with China. I see that James wanted to clarify something there. So in the meanwhile, maybe please, James, can you clarify? You have the right to reply. James Galbraith, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just preparing a reply in the chat, but I'll just clarify quickly that our study does not require any part of the electorate to be conscious of inequality. It is simply measures the proportion of the electorate that is in males or the center of the distribution in each state. So that's the point. Inequality is a very good indicator, but it's not itself the social issue that's at issue here. With respect to the question to the point about race, it is a fact, of course, that the most unequal states in the United States have always been those that have been characterized by the sharpest racial divide, which is to say the deep South states of the old Confederacy. But what we're picking up is the change in the alignment of American politics as a result of the change in inequality since the early 1990s. And the biggest changes in inequality are not in the South, and they're not in the Midwest. They're on the two coasts. They're in California, they're in New York, along the coast. The rise of very, very wealthy urban centers dominated by finance in the East, technology in the West, and the great expansion of low-income minority communities, particularly in the West and now across the Southwest. So when those two things are happening together, you get the shifts, and you can see this state by state. As states move up the rankings of inequality, they shift from Republican to Democratic, and they stay shifted. So that's what we're seeing. The Democratic Party is, of course, now a multiracial coalition. It's a multiracial coalition dominated by wealthy white urbanites and with a smattering of other ethnic groups in that category, and backed by large populations of low-income minorities. That's why that's the tension in the Democratic Party, and that's how it has risen since the early 1990s to the present electoral position that it holds.
Thank you. So let me ask if anybody want to mention the possibility of a third party, or it's even impossible to talk about it.
I can go ahead and briefly mention. I think that certainly the electoral rules matter. I don't think having what we call a first past the post or a plurality electoral system makes it impossible to develop a third party, but it requires that you have a certain breadth of support to become electoral competitive. Otherwise, it's basically a wasted vote. And keep in mind, this is one of the reasons why is it that Trumpism, as sort of an insurgent, populist, anti-establishment kind of movement, why does that emerge within the Republican Party rather than establishing itself as some sort of alternative kind of like if you were in Europe, if you had a parliamentary system with proportional representation, Trumpism would have had to emerge outside the Republican Party as a niche party on the far right. And Trump, I think, certainly represents a type of far right, as you see in many parts of Europe. The difference is that he has done it within a mainstream conservative party, and he has, I would argue, transformed the Republican Party into the equivalent of a European far-right party. And what's ironic is that the party is highly ideological, and it clearly represents a far-right, but it is still able to compete for the median voter, right? This is still a party that is competing close to 50% of the electorate, and that's quite different from what you see certainly in Western Europe. Eastern Europe is a different matter. So I think that ultimately, it'll be interesting to see. I think there'll be pressure both within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party because of the internal tensions as they go forward, as I was talking about before. But it's very difficult to turn those tensions into third-party movements in the existing institutional framework of American democracy.
Thank you. And what about the next issue in the list, that is whether the constitutional order of the US can withstand the clash between powers that we may see in the next few years?
I have a thought about that. I think that's a very interesting question, but I would answer it in a slightly different way, and that is, I think that federalism is becoming, and may already have become, an important institutional axis in American politics. Many people have dismissed the state politics as there's been a very distinct nationalization of American party politics. What's happened under the Trump administration is that there's been an attempt on some level to bring states back as active players. Part of this was the result of the Trump non-response to the coronavirus issue, but part of it also had to do with Trump's immigration and racial policies, in which we are beginning to see coalitions of state attorneys general, that is, procurators general, coalitions across states of the top legal officers in the state coming together and challenging what the administration is doing at the national level. This may bring state politics back into the game of institutional conflict, where they have not been for many, many years.
Good. Can I also just make a statement? I think it's a great question by Manuela, and I think it's also interesting to reflect back upon the debate around these issues when we thought a couple of weeks ago that the Democrats might have a more resounding victory, that there might actually be a blue wave, and that they would not only capture the presidency by a comfortable margin, but perhaps win the Senate and strengthen their margin in the House. That clearly has not happened. But at that point in time, there was talk about all kinds of basic institutional reforms, potentially changing the tenure or even the composition of the Supreme Court because of the way in which it's been packed under the Republicans. Talk about possibly giving statehood representation in Congress to Puerto Rico and to Washington, D.C. And so basic talk about getting rid of the Electoral College, which I would argue is a profoundly anti-democratic, certainly an anti-majoritarian institution in American democracy. But there are these are all basically ways in which a minority party, the Republican Party, has been able to capture certain institutional levers and use them against the majority party, essentially, and to constrain popular Democratic majorities. And so there was on the agenda, certainly of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, a whole series of basic institutional reforms that they were hoping to advance. I think those are all off the table. I cannot imagine Biden getting anywhere with any of those, given where we stand today. What I anticipate is gridlock, meaning very high levels of conflict between the executive and certainly the Senate and probably the Supreme Court. And I think the more that Biden, to the extent that he does try to advance a progressive agenda, the more likely, Manuela, I think it is that we'll see significant conflicts between these different branches of the government, much like you saw under Roosevelt in the 1930s, when Roosevelt, trying to advance the New Deal, and eventually resorted to trying to pack the Supreme Court because the court kept blocking the things he was trying to do. I don't think we're going to get that far under Biden, but I think if he did try to advance a progressive agenda, we would see something of that sort.
So the following question from Mario Pianta was about what can be done with white, non-college educated rather than uneducated men. Is there anything that can be done for to make them vote according to their material interest rather than their identity? Any idea about that, or there is no hope? Then we move to the next question. Any hope?
Sid, why don't you take a crack at that one?
Take a crack at it because I still have hope for the white working class, which is the class I come from. And I think I would not dismiss the small shift in white voters to the Democrats, or I should say back to the Democrats in the November election. I wouldn't make too much of it, but what is striking is that much of the detachment of the white working class from their class interests was due to the fact that we were living through an unprecedented period of economic prosperity. And to the extent that the Republicans could convince people that they were responsible for this economic prosperity, whether they were or not is another question, then people like the voters in Kansas who voted for the Republicans, despite their economic interests, would vote Republican. We are headed, I think, most economists would agree, for a much more difficult economic situation. And as James pointed out, we have a period of increasing inequality. And I would guess that this increasing inequality and low economic growth is eventually going to affect many of those white working class voters. May I also say that I've never been a strong believer that Trumpism has been based largely on the white working class. If you look at the support for Trumpism, particularly that sector of Trumpism that came out of the Tea Party movement, it is profoundly middle and upper middle class. It is not a working class vote. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Sid. That's an issue in Europe as well, and it's distorted. The white, non-college educated men group is distorted by age, so it's mostly more elderly people, and it includes the middle class, which used to be non-college educated. It's not working class as such necessarily. And finally, anybody about China or any other comment? We are stretching the expertise of our American friends in all directions. If there is any answer about China or any other final comments, given we are running out of time, you know, and we all want to go to a good restaurant. Oh no, we can't.
I'll just say on China, I worry about the United States moving towards a new Cold War with China, and I don't have a good feel for how this is going to play out. I would hope that the Biden administration would be a little more restrained in that. I've been very concerned about the ways in which Trump has tried to use as part of his nationalism, and then using China as kind of the boogeyman, but trying to use opposition to China as a way to try to mobilize nationalist bases within the United States. And I think that brand of nationalistic, potentially xenophobic politics, especially when it's done for domestic political purposes, is extremely dangerous. And I think that Biden is less, perhaps I would hope, less susceptible to that. But I do worry about sort of a coarsening and the hardening of American discourse with respect to China and where that could lead. I would be very concerned about sort of rival nationalistic mobilizations in China and the United States, whether it's Democrats or Republicans behind that in the United States. So it's something that I worry about.
So we have a lot of reasons to worry. I see Donatella coming back again, so I stopped my replacement. I filled the gap and I disappeared. Donatella, you want to conclude or ask other questions? Donatella, we want your voice back as well, and not only
yes. Well, it has been interesting debate and a long one. We went bit beyond what we had planned, but I think it shows that there is a lot of need for this type of events, and that we may organize a next one when we have some more information. So I remember when we were planning this debate, we had initially thought maybe we will have it on the 5th of November. Then we said Sid wisely said, not before the next week, and we move it to today, hoping that we had a formally appointed new president. We are still in a situation in which there is a lot of uncertainty about the time and so on. And so I think that especially on the issues of the social basis for Trumpism and the ways in which divisions within the democratic parties could be, if not overcome, at least used in a more progressive way than in the past. It is a very important question to address. And so I thank Ken and Sid and all those who have participated. We have two other roundtables of this type in the next 4 weeks. One is on Chile erasing the Pinochet constitution on Friday in 2 weeks, and the other one is on the Bolivia return of mass with Santiago, who is here now with us, and all are welcome to come. And we also wanted to extend any invitations to our PhD students to suggest us also events that we can organize. Online events are always less pleasant than offline ones, but still very, very interesting and needed. So thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
It was fun.
Bye.
Thanks, Donatella.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Thanks. It was fun. Enjoyed it. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Salutare Tarrow.
Bye. Bye, everybody, and thank you so much.
Thank you.